Welcome to the program. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Israeli military are still continuing what they call a precise operation against Hamas fighters in Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital. The clashes and attacks come despite a United Nations Security Council resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza during the holy month of Ramadan. The Israeli military said its forces are continuing their siege of Al-Shifa hospital, where they've claimed to have killed a number of Hamas fighters who they claim are operating in the facility. Israeli strikes throughout Gaza have also killed numerous civilians in the last 24 hours, including children sheltering in the western region of Khan Yunis. In the meantime, Lebanon's health ministry has condemned an early morning airstrike conducted by Israel on an emergency facility in the southern part of the country. 7 paramedics were killed in the attack, 4 others injured. The Israeli military claimed the facility was a military building, adding it killed a member of Lebanon's Islamic group. A statement by the ministry partly reads, "These unacceptable attacks violate international laws and norms, especially the Geneva Convention, which stresses the neutrality of health centers and health workers, and that Israeli airstrikes on health infrastructure would not be overlooked. Hezbollah has pledged to avenge the attack, saying it will not pass without punishment." And the United Nations has been reacting to recent attacks and hostilities in Gaza, describing the situation as worsening by the day. The UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East, Tor Wensland, says more than 1 million people in the besieged strip are estimated to face acute malnutrition, starvation, and dehydration.
In Gaza, the humanitarian impact of the hostilities have been cataclysmic and is worsening daily. Nearly 1.7 million people have been displaced, with almost 1 million sheltering in Rafah. More than 1 million Palestinian people in Gaza are projected to face catastrophic level of food insecurity by the end of May. And famine in the northern part of Gaza is imminent, according to the latest IPC analysis. Indeed, starvation-related fatalities have already been reported. Near daily Israeli denials and delays of coordination of movement, including detention of humanitarian workers and ineffective deconflicting mechanisms, and the lack of approval of adequate communication equipment and armed vehicles, makes humanitarian work extremely dangerous. Aid convoys continue to face attacks, damaged roads, and unruly mobs amid a security vacuum. Some progress was made on the maritime corridor from Cyprus, with the first shipment arriving on 15 March, alongside opening of an access point in the north of Gaza. International humanitarian law cannot be applied selectively. It applies to all parties to a conflict at all times, and the obligations to comply with it does not depend on reciprocity. I mourn the UN staff killed in Gaza. Their courage and dedications will not be forgotten. The inviolability of UN premises must be respected at all times.
Meanwhile, spokesperson for the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, James Elder, has visited the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza. He's concluded from what he's seen, the place is a humanitarian catastrophe. He indicated that there were backlogs of humanitarian trucks queuing to get into Gaza, where aid supplies are needed desperately. UNICEF is calling for immediate action to avert an impending famine across the country.
I was again in Jabalia. Tens of thousands of people crowd the streets. They make that universal signal sign as you go through the streets, again, as they stand in rubble, that universal signal of hand to mouth, desperately asking and seeking for food. When I came into the Gaza Strip just over a week ago, there were hundreds of trucks of life-saving humanitarian aid waiting to get to these people in urgent need but on the wrong side of the border. Hundreds of trucks of UN and INGO supplies are currently backlogged. There is an existing old crossing point that could be used in the north 10 minutes from where those people are putting their hands to their mouth, pleading for food. 10 minutes. Open that and we could turn this humanitarian crisis around in a matter of days.
The north remains on total blockade and it's inaccessible. And definitely we have enough evidence that shows there is ongoing starvation. There's extreme acute food insecurity and lack of major food supplies and water. And those who claim otherwise probably have to provide evidence for that. There are cases of death as a result of starvation, and those are the early indications of famine. And I hope we're not waiting for famine declaration, because the situation as it exists calls for action, which is long overdue.
You cannot claim to adhere to these international provisions of law when you block UNRWA food convoys, when you just last week denied 5 missions to the north, when we have now reports of Israeli attacks on warehouses and the police that are supposed to help secure this aid inside Gaza.
The VOA's Ricky Rosson is in Tel Aviv. Ricky, great to see you. Now, these UN officials have been describing the situation on the ground in Gaza, even before now, before, the UNICEF and the Food and Agricultural Organization and other UN agencies that have been visiting Gaza have been speaking of an emerging human catastrophe. There are hundreds of people trying to exist with very little supplies. And you did hear James Elder say that, the food trucks were on the other side of the border. Why is the Israeli government not moved by these reports?
Israeli officials continue to claim that they are allowing these hundreds of trucks of aid through the land crossings, as well as shipments dropped by air and coming in by sea. But even if this is true, the infrastructure for the aid distribution has been nearly destroyed. So the process is so chaotic and it's practically dysfunctional. And we've seen that Gazans have died trying to get to the airdropped aid shipments. And just a few days ago, 12 drowned trying to get aid that fell into the sea. So the trucks are not the only answer, and the distribution problems within Gaza are immense, and there's nobody to take control of it.
But it is easier having the food trucks come in. I mean, you just reported, you just mentioned people drowning at sea while trying to receive, the food aids, the airdrops. And even that is even more dangerous, because most times people are focused on, getting, the packs and not looking where they're going and things like that. So isn't it easier or safer to go with the food trucks? Shouldn't Israel allow more food trucks into Gaza if it cares about the people?
As I said, when we've asked the officials from Kogat, which is the Israeli army unit which takes care of issues involving Palestinian civilians rather than military issues, they continue to insist that they do inspect hundreds of trucks a day and allow them through the land crossings, and that the bottleneck of distribution is on the other side once the trucks are inside Gaza.
Right. Now, on Monday, the Israeli government rejected a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire. It said this would only embolden Hamas. Israel has rejected Hamas's proposals, its proposals for the ceasefire, which is not just a ceasefire, but other conditions as well. The downside to this is that the Israeli bombardment continues on Gaza, re-emphasizing the fears that the international community has about the rising number of casualties, and the humanitarian crisis is growing in Gaza. What deal, Ricky, does the Israeli government consider appealing, and at the point at which it would agree, to a ceasefire in Gaza?
The Israeli government wants only a deal which ties a temporary ceasefire to the release of hostages. They said that they are willing also to release up to 800 Palestinian prisoners in the West Bank, including 100 who are serving life sentences for murder. They are also willing to allow a gradual return of civilians to the northern part of Gaza, which is suffering most from the humanitarian crisis. But they want it only to be under Israeli control so that Hamas fighters don't return to the north together with the civilians.
And walk us through, Ricky, if you can, Israel's plan for Rafah. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, says the offensive in Gaza will not be complete until, this war enters into Rafah.
Well, in truth, neither Netanyahu nor the Israeli army really have a plan for an operation in Rafah, certainly not in the near future. They would need to mobilize another 4 to 5 army battalions, which would mean another call up of reserve soldiers, which takes time. They also insist that they would move 1.5 million civilians out of the battlefield, but have not shown any practical plans for that. So many Israelis are coming to think that this talk by Netanyahu is a political move to keep Israelis and the world believing that he will win this war, and not a realistic plan.
But there is already an offensive in Rafah, right? It started. There's a ground offensive in Rafah.
It's not what the Israeli army considers an offensive. They are fighting isolated groups of Hamas fighters, but it's not the kind of offensive that they are threatening to launch, which would involve going into all the tunnels and eliminating the remaining Hamas battalions that are still in the very south in Rafah.
And why does the Prime Minister consider Rafah this important to the Israeli-Hamas war?
It's considered the last stronghold of Hamas because the leaders of Hamas, including Yahya Sinwar, are believed to be hiding in the tunnels under Rafah, probably together with some of the Israeli hostages. And it's also thought that the tunnels go under the border with Egypt. And so in the last decade or so, the tunnels were used for smuggling in weapons. And Israel is afraid that if Rafah and the tunnels inside it are not dismantled, that this could continue even after a war. Weapons would be smuggled in, and Hamas fighters and leaders could be smuggled out and allowed to escape.
Now, I did read a story about the situation in Al-Shifa. That's the latest receiving Israeli bombardments in Gaza. What is the excuse for the operation here?
The Israeli army has claimed and shown evidence that they arrested about 800 people, about 500 of whom were shown to be militants from Hamas and Islamic Jihad. They also collected a huge number of weapons. And so they are saying that the hospital, which was previously in December and January the place of an Israeli bombardment, and they said that they had found Hamas headquarters underneath the hospital, as well as arms being stored within the hospital. And now they're saying that apparently once they left the area a few months ago, Hamas and Islamic Jihad fighters have returned and taken up positions inside the hospital. And so the army went in to arrest and fight them.
Right. Ricky, just before you go, What is Israel's response to this, to the continued anti-Israeli campaigns holding around the world, calling for an end to the ceasefire and also calling for an end to the war in Gaza?
Israel continues to maintain that the world has to understand that this war was launched by Hamas when it invaded Israel on October 7th, and that it is a war of defense and survival and has to be accepted by the world as such. And they continue to maintain that Hamas should be blamed rather than Israel.
Thanks again, Ricky. I appreciate your reporting.
Thank you.